Welcome to the Women Changing the World podcast, a podcast on a mission to bring you some of the most amazing women I know who are doing incredible things to generally make the world a better place. From corporate sustainability to straight up magic and everything in between, you'll meet the real life humans who are birthing the new. I'm your host, Liz Best, and I'm here to amplify the stories and voices of women who are changing the world. Hello, and welcome to another new episode of the Women Changing the World podcast. Today, I am so excited to sit down with Kathy Oneto. Kathy works at the intersection of strategy, innovation, and talent, helping organizations and individuals take sustainable action. She is a strategist, speaker, and executive and life work coach who is committed to helping people thrive on their terms, both in life and work. She is the founder of Sustainable Ambition and host of the Sustainable Ambition podcast. Her mission is to champion more expansive views of success and ambition and help people craft a life with work from decade to decade that offers more joy, satisfaction, and fulfillment so they can be ambitious with more adventure and ease and less angst. We talked about so much today: what sustainable ambition is, Kathy's framework of right ambition, right timing, and right effort, and how to identify those things for yourself, how Kathy came to be where she is today and the different aspects of her portfolio career, ingredients for creating your own sustaining plan, sustainable ambition as an evolving practice, leadership in our current moment, the relationship between clarity, vision, values, and self-trust, and so much more. This conversation touches on so many of the big themes that we've been exploring on the podcast, that we talk about within the Girls Club Collective community, and that are so interesting to me in life and work at this moment. And I just know you're going to enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm so excited today to be talking about a topic that I know is on the hearts of so many of us, which is ambition, and specifically sustainable ambition. And there is no one that I am more excited to have that conversation with than Kathy Oneto. Welcome to the podcast, Kathy.
Thanks so much for having me, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh my goodness, it's so exciting to have you here. I can't wait for our conversation. I guess maybe before we jump in, for anyone who's listening who doesn't already know you, would you mind just briefly introducing yourself to our listeners?
Sure. I'm going to start this way. I'm practicing introducing myself in a form of being as opposed to doing. So I will say I am someone who walks through the world with an aspiration to be curious, conscientious, and kind. That's a part of who I am, but I am also a strategist and an executive and life work coach who is committed to helping people thrive on their terms, both in life and work. And I'm also the founder of Sustainable Ambition and also host the podcast of the same name.
I love that introduction, and I love beginning with the being. That's so beautiful, and I'm going to have to think about what my being introduction is. Thank you for that. Maybe before we get into sustainable ambition, which we will talk a lot about, you gave us a little bit of context around the doing and what you're doing right now professionally and how you're being in the world, but would love to hear a little bit more about what you're currently up to before we get into all things sustainable ambition.
Sure, that sounds good. Well, I really think of my work today as being a portfolio. There are a lot of people that have portfolio careers today, and I'm no different. And I frame it in the context of kind of having three different sides. Part of my work is consulting work where I work at the intersection of, I say, like strategy, innovation, and talent or people kind of challenges, and doing work in that space, working with organizations. But as I mentioned, I also do coaching work, both what I call life and work coaching. And that's really choiceful in terms of marrying those two words, because I don't think of myself as just a life coach. And I don't think of myself as just a career coach or somebody who is helping people find their next job. I really think about it as I work with people who are exploring what their next life and work arcs are and how those two integrate together. And that's a component of sustainable ambition. And then I also do executive coaching as well. So for individuals who are looking to up their leadership, or in terms of who they want to be in the world of work, and going after certain ambitions in that way as well. And then the third prong is what I call my creative work. And sustainable ambition also falls into that to some degree, because I do see what I'm doing around the podcast, or I'm starting to explore speaking. I've also been working on a book over the last year and a half or more. And that's certainly a creative act. And so that's been a big component of where I have spent my time over the last many years.
Oh, that's so cool. I so appreciate the portfolio career framing. I feel like that for me, when I first got into entrepreneurship, was something that I held so close to my heart, was the desire to be able to have a portfolio career and do many things. And I also really appreciate how you're framing the work that you do. I think it's so funny being in the coaching world. Like, executive coaching feels like such a sometimes stuffy name for like the work that I get to do around leadership coaching. And as we both know, it's so hard to do any type of coaching around the work stuff without also talking about the life stuff. And I feel like I'm continuously curious around, like, how do we describe this magic in words?
I think it's a great point. When I first got into the coaching world, some people would ask for what type of coaching I do. And they were very specific about the word choices. And, if you're not in the world of coaching, you don't necessarily know what these terms mean. How is executive coaching different than career coaching? And oftentimes the labels aren't that helpful, which is what you're getting at, Liz, right?
Yeah.
It's like kind of like, and many of us who are coaches, we are taught to coach the whole person, right? It's not just, you aren't looking at one specific individual aspect. And that's really interesting too. When I do my coaching work, oftentimes it's interesting. People don't often come to me just for, oh, I want to work on the sustainable ambition intersection of it. And that's, I think, because the sustainability aspect runs through it all. It's not separate. And I think that's what you were bringing up.
Totally. And the ambition piece also runs through it all. It's so related and it's so fun to me and like wild. I feel like the conversations that I've been getting to have with people in my world recently around like thinking about how we apply ambition to other areas of our life besides exclusively work, which I know is something that you've done so much thinking about. So maybe let's like get into it with sustainable ambition. I would love to start with your definition of how you think about that term and maybe the origin story of where the phrase came from for you.
So I think of sustainable ambition as really being a strategic approach for pursuing both our professional and our personal goals in a way that's really meaningful, motivating, and importantly, manageable from stage to stage. And when I say stage to stage, I'm thinking of life stages over time. And importantly, also, rather than it being all consuming in a way that really ends up compromising certain important aspects of our life, or compromises or sacrifices our well-being. So that's how I think about sustainable ambition. And I'll tell you two kind of components of the origin story, because I think that in some ways, the origin story of sustainable ambition starts all the way back when I was in college and trying to decide, hey, there's this goal out there of being a guide on my college campus. And I was thinking, like, do I want to go after this goal? And really questioning, is this something I want, that I really have a true aspiration for? Or am I, if I were to go after it, am I doing it simply because it's something that looks good on a resume and would help me get a chance to live on the lawn. I went to the University of Virginia, and like that was a thing, right? And it's just kind of like, am I checking that box to check the box, or is this something I really have an interest in? And those kind of questions started all the way back then for me. And kind of over the course of my adult life, I had different experiences that really made me think about both these aspects, both the ambition side of things, but also the sustainability side of things, and making certain trade offs, if you will, between those. In terms of where the term actually came from, it came out of a discussion that I was having with my husband after a workshop that I held on career transitions with some colleagues and friends, people that I had gotten together to actually take them through some of my exercises and things, because all of them are going through career transitions at the time. This was early 2020, right before the pandemic, probably not when I should have been having people gather, but of course I didn't know that at the time. And my husband and I were just reflecting on the conversations that we were having, and we were talking about how one of the attendees had really exclaimed how, gosh, my ambitions really steered me wrong. I went after these certain ambitions. I climbed this ladder. I got to the top, and I didn't like what I saw. And so it was just in the course of describing some of the other conversations. Of course, I had already been thinking about some of these concepts for some time. And so he said, I have to attribute it to my husband. He said, it's kind of like sustainable ambition. And I was like, yes, and it really stuck. And as I started to share that term with others, again, it really became something that really resonated with a lot of people.
Oh, wow. That's such an interesting, both of those stories. I also have to ask if you're willing to share, did you end up becoming a guide at UVA? Did you live on the lawn?
I did not, and I did not live on the lawn. Oh, well.
Well, I love how you have been exploring this question for such a long time. And it's also really cool to hear the aha moment and like the thread that has really guided, I know, so much of your work since 2020. I'd actually love to go back a little bit, because I know our listeners really love hearing how people came to be where they are today. And I feel like you gave us some like high level details, but I would love to hear a little bit more, if you're willing to share, of your journey between, I mean, you can start in undergrad, we don't have to, but from that moment of like questioning your ambition, I imagine much younger, to doing the work that you're doing today. Like, what has your path to here looked like?
Yeah, I will actually go back to undergrad, and only because stepping away from school and making a choice about what I was going to do post college was a moment of choosing sustainable ambition for me. And I won't say, and I think that I've kept sustainable ambition as a concept kind of has been consistent throughout my life. And yet I didn't know it at the time. It's really been as I've reflected back. And I will also say it's not as if I always got it right. And so, but when I left college at the time, I moved to New York City. And as I was choosing a job, I was making a choice between, do I want a job that's going to fully consume me, or do I want a job that's going to allow me to have some space in my life? And I ended up choosing the latter. And it was still ended up being a great job. And I still had great experiences. And I was able to, though, in that also enjoy New York City while I lived there. And so that was something that was really beneficial to me. And when I went back to business school, I had some colleagues I came back to school in California, and I had some friends who were going to school at another school across the bay, and they had worked in investment banking, and we were chatting, and they were like, wait, Kathy, how did you do all those things again while we were in the city? And I was like, look, guys, you were working 70, 80-hour weeks. I was working about like 50. Like, I wasn't working every single weekend. And so I was able to fit other things in. And so I always kind of had that kind of desire, I think, and just I've always had ambitions outside of work that often were, if not more rewarding, just as important to me, certainly as my work ambitions were to me. So I was always wanted to do well at work, but I always had things outside that gave me a lot of fulfillment and satisfaction and joy. And so I was always bringing those things in. So after business school, I ended up spending the majority of my career in brand management. And so have a background in branding and marketing, innovation, really business management. I worked at Clorox for a long time, which is, where I really got my foundational training in that. But I always had a little bit of an entrepreneurial bug. So even before going away to college, part of the reason I ended up studying undergraduate business as well as graduate business, because I thought I might want to start a business someday. And so here I am. But before I got to here, I had also, once I left Clorox, I joined an incubator and helped co-found a natural food startup. And so helped launch that business into the world. I was the first employee on that business, helping to shape it and craft it. So after that experience, what I was really learning was that I loved the shaping of brands and really strategy. And so ended up joining a branding and design agency and was there for about 6 years and ended up as a VP of brand strategy there. And so again, that was kind of like my arc in terms of branding and marketing world. But from there, also started to realize that it was, I live in the Bay Area. I live in the tech centered world and had really spent a lot of my time with consumer brands, retail brands, and was feeling like it was time to get some e-commerce experience. So I jumped to another startup to do that. So really have lived in both large company world, working both inside or with clients that were large companies, but also in that smaller entrepreneurial world as well. And that's where I also had some interest. So it was really after that experience that I started to explore wanting to step out on my own. And it was based on a time when I started to just feel that my own ambitions were shifting and that I was wanting something more. And it's interesting because I think, again, it was with a sustainable ambition kind of lens. Like I wanted something different, but I don't have kids, but I was also at that time, after 2 really intense jobs, seeking more flexibility and a way for me to figure out how I could manage my time and energy best based on how I operate best to make it sustainable.
Absolutely. Oh, that's such an inspiring story. And I guess I'm curious if you're willing to share a little bit more too, like in making that entrepreneurial transition. I know many of the people who listen to this podcast are founders or have ambitions of starting businesses one day. How has like the balance of different things that you've had on your plate as an entrepreneur within your portfolio career shifted over time?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer it in this way, which is it's definitely been a learning journey. I think myself and my peers, I feel like it ends up being a learning journey in terms of for a number of reasons. So let me go back and try to unpack that a little bit in terms of like, well, why am I saying that? Because you're asking me like, how has my portfolio changed? When I first stepped out as self-employed individual, I thought I was going to build an agency. I thought that's what I wanted to do, or that's like what my expertise was. So I think I'm going to build an agency. I still even have that website, the Agency Oneto. And yet, as I stepped out and I started in my first year and really started to test that out, I started to learn that wasn't what I wanted to build. And so that's why I say it's been a learning journey. So it's interesting because the marketplace shifts. I change in terms of what I want to do. And so the way that I work and the business model that I follow, I continue to learn what works best for me. And so I continue to shape it over time. And so what I would say is still the majority of my work over time has been in consulting. The second is around the coaching. And so it goes back to those portfolio elements that I've been talking about. And I'll be transparent in saying I'm in another transition time and I'm trying to figure out, okay, what is that next stage going to look like and how do I want to craft it and what's going to work best for me as I step into this next stage.
I so deeply appreciate the reflection and the transparency because I know for so many of us when we first get started, I think there are often core elements of what we want to do that we know are true for us, but there's so many aspects of like learning how to run our own business and figuring out, evolving alongside things like a global pandemic that the vision evolves. So thank you for sharing both like how it's evolved for you over time and that it's continuing to evolve. I really appreciate that. Well, coming back to the concept of ambition, one of the phrases that you had mentioned that I'm excited to talk a lot more about is the idea of like ambition as a U curve, or the U curve of ambition, and how it can be a good thing. So for people who are listening who are like, what's the U curve? Let's start there. Like, what is it? And then we'd love to talk about positive aspects of ambition and our relationship with it.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's just to start with that, because it will just be an overarching kind of component of the U curve idea, which is I don't see ambition as good or bad, but it's about getting it right for you. And what this means to me is like, I think ambition takes a conscious kind of dialing in to make it sustainable. I mean, so that's a big component of it. So when I say ambition follows a U curve, I'm borrowing from the U curve theory of pressure and performance, which is kind of analogous, which is that if you don't have enough pressure when you're going after something or trying something, think if you're participating in a sport or what have you, too little pressure, we end up becoming bored and we don't perform. If there's too much pressure on us trying to do something and we're overly stressed and anxious as a result, then we don't perform. And so it's really about getting that level of pressure right. It's kind of like what level of stress, if you think about the concept of flow as well, to get it right such that we perform at our best. And so I think of ambition similarly in that, if we have too little ambition, we can end up feeling like we're floundering or we're feeling stagnant. If we have too much ambition, then it takes us into what I call just simply the danger zone, right? Of leaving us in a state of kind of hyper ambition, perhaps being overextended, perhaps being even unhappy because we're just driving all the time. And so we can some of us can at times get overly addicted to this striving in a negative sense. And so for me, when I think about just right ambition or really getting it dialed in, if you will, my hope is that it can motivate us to pursue what we want for ourselves in our life, which really is a natural thing for us as humans. We desire things. We do have ambitions. And I also think there's a lot of things in this world that we have both achieved for ourselves or that people have achieved in the world or to contribute to the world that are positive outcomes. And so that's what I mean by the U curve of ambition is seeing it as kind of not good, not bad, but importantly trying to get it just right. And importantly, that just right is about for you. I mean, I use the word right for a reason, but sometimes people hear, oh, there's a right or wrong to this. And that's not what I'm trying to say. It's really about like kind of the Goldilocks kind of right. It's like getting it just right for you.
It's so interesting to hear you describe the U curve in that way, because I feel like what immediately comes up for me is like how that's true for so many other things too. Like the idea that there's like an optimal amount of busy, that if we had like fully open days all the time, that we like suffer. And we also suffer when we're scheduled within an inch of our lives. And so for each of us, the balance in there is a different balance. But yeah, I think it's so interesting how that concept can be applied to, I think, other things as well. So it totally makes sense that it can also be applied to ambition.
I agree with you on that point. This is probably more the reality in our world is that things are meant to be in the middle as opposed to on the extremes, or that the realities of just the complexity of our world, that there's more in the gray than there being at the poles, right?
Totally. Well, and because I'm sure people who are listening are wondering how. Like, how do I figure out where in the U curve I want to be? I mean, something about your work that I love that I don't think enough people talk about is the idea that like we may want to be in different places at different stages of our life. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, for someone who's listening, who's like, well, I would love to right size my ambition, but like, how?
That's a great question. There's a couple of things that I'll offer in terms of the how. And then if you have additional questions to kind of prompt me to go deeper, that'd be great. I think part of it is starting also just with this mindset around like not seeing it as good or bad and making it be okay that to have ambition. One way too, in terms of this, I'm just going to contextually share this in terms of how I think about ambition too, that I think can help in terms of dialing it in, if you will, is to I view ambition as being not just for work. Oftentimes people think of ambition as just being about one's career or what you're doing from a professional standpoint. I think of ambition as being holistic in terms of anything that you might want to accomplish in life or just want to experience in life. I should almost take the word accomplishment out of it. The other components of it that I think you're talking about in terms of this allowing myself to kind of, how do I figure out how I dial it in? I think part of it also is a mindset thing, which is allowing yourself to have it ebb and flow. And I think that can be both, oh, I can allow my ambitions to change, because oftentimes people feel like, no, I got on this path, I need to stay on this path. And it's really disorienting when things do shift on us. And to me, because I've been thinking about this for so long and because I'm reading a lot about change these days, I'm kind of like, it's so many people talk about like change is everywhere. It's inevitable, right? This next second is going to change. And so, accepting that, but it doesn't mean that this isn't really disorienting when things shift on us and we're not wanting to pursue what we used to want to pursue. But the other part of it is allowing ourselves for this up and down. And that's not necessarily always easy. Part of it, though, is self-management. It's allowing for it, but our society doesn't really champion that much. And so that's part of what's required is shifting one's own mindset to fight against kind of what these societal norms can often be. I also will just say that it also, just from a mindset perspective, I think is helpful for people to know, at least from my perspective, is like ambition doesn't have to mean striving and driving all the time. Humans are really meant to be in two states of like using our energy and refueling. And so restoring our energy. And so keeping that in mind, that we can't always be driving all the time. So part of what's important in terms of figuring this out is getting conscious about it, tapping into what's personally important to you. Those are some things that are core components of it, but I can go deeper, Liz. I want to kind of let you guide me from here.
Thank you. Well, yes, I know this is like, again, such a big topic, and I feel like this is a really helpful grounding for us as we think about how we can reimagine or redefine ambition for ourselves. One of the questions I heard in your answer as a starting point is this question of like, what do I want to be ambitious about right now? Which can include so many things beyond work. We can be ambitious about rest. We can be ambitious about being. We can be ambitious about community or family, like so many things, as I know you know. What are some of the other questions that we might want to ask ourselves as we begin to identify where we want to place ourselves on an ambition spectrum?
I think where I'll go with this is, when I think about sustainable ambition, I have a method that I relate to, that I use, which is anchored in 3 pillars of aligning the right ambitions at the right time with the right effort. And I do think the first question is like, well, what am I ambitious about? Like, what do I want to do? And I lean into kind of 4 core motivators to help us identify, well, what do I want to be ambitious about? And how can I anchor those ambitions so they are personally satisfying? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't include some things that are kind of perhaps external ambitious goals that might be externally motivated. But my rooting and what's important to me about this is, how do you motivate your own effort? How do you link it to something that is personally motivating to you? And so I point people to like, well, what is the vision that you hold for yourself? If you took a future self kind of oriented view, what is that long distance vision that you have? Even if it's going to change, you can't get anywhere if you don't have that vision of kind of where you're orienting towards. How do you like to give and contribute out in the world? And of course, oftentimes people today talk about this as being purpose. I will use the term purpose as well, but I also like to bring it down to this idea of like, well, how do you want to give and contribute out in the world? Because I think it makes it a little bit less, lofty and also accessible from a standpoint of like, there are so many ways that we can really give and contribute, even if it's just a reminder to myself, like, how can I be kind today? That's a way of giving and contributing in the world. It doesn't have to be this huge thing. And I also look at, what do you value? And a lot of people will point towards values. What's really helpful in looking at values is that our values can shift some over time, but oftentimes they can be really steady, and they are what they can guide us in terms of what's really important to us in our lives. And what can change is how you prioritize those values. And so when you say, like, well, how do I know what I should prioritize now? So at one stage in life, family might not be as important. Well, in another stage of life where you now have a partner and you might have chosen to have children, like, guess what? Or you have, like me, like older parents, family's important, or caregiving's important. And so how that raises in your priority list and what your holistic ambitions might be, that's going to change. And so your values can really help in that regard. Even something, I'll bring it down to a simpler example. Even something like, I use the term now vitality for myself, but when I was younger and more athletic, and I was an athlete and I did marathons and triathlons, like, I was quite ambitious about that, and I was trying to achieve in that regard. Well, today vitality for me looks a lot different given my injuries that I've sustained over time, but it's still a value that I hold, and what my ambition looks like and the kind of time demands around that look a lot different today. And so the other thing that I look at around right ambition is love. Like, what do you love doing, and tapping into those intrinsic motivators. So right ambition is that component. Right time is really like prioritizing what's important now. How do I want to focus my energy and my effort, and really looking at that with a lens of through life and work. And also in this, I'll admit that I've shifted my thinking on this list, because originally I used to say, and I still say, plan life first. But I mean, when I say that, it's not to dictate, like, never be ambitious about your work. I like to be non-judgmental within the sustainable ambition world and let people choose, because some people are going to choose, hey, I want to try to be really ambitious about my work and really ambitious about other things in my personal life. And all I would say to that is, like, yes, wonderful, great, go for it. And make sure you're putting in place the structures that are going to support you in sustaining yourself through that. If you don't want to be feeling exhausted and potentially burnt out in the future. And so that's right time. And then I'll briefly just touch on right effort, because I know I'm going a little long.
Well, I was going to ask you about all three, so this is perfect.
Okay, great. So right effort is really about thinking about, how do I manage my effort and my energy around this? And so how do I be discerning about both, how ambitious do I want to be? What really are my aspirations? What is worth my hard work? And I do personally, I know some people are like, what do you mean hard work? And I'm like, yeah, but things that we're typically ambitious about, we put hard work into them. We want to achieve something. So it's just really being discerning about, where do you want to put in the hard work, and what effort is desired and what effort is required. And are you just being thoughtful about where you're putting your effort and energy? And then importantly, how are you thinking about sustaining that energy? So it's really that two-part component of, like, where am I deploying my energy and using it up, or am I putting my effort, and how am I going to restore myself and to make sure that I can sustain myself both in the short term, but also over the long term as well.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Well, I love the framework that you use to think about this. I think the three pillars and three dimensions, they capture so much, as you know, in terms of really making this practical and useful, and not a formula for us to burn ourselves out, which I know on the effort piece, I think on all the dimensions, right? Like, that this is a really thoughtful way. I know so many of those of us who care about building a better future, who are working in sustainability or social impact, or in businesses that we care a lot about, like managing our own effort and energy and ambition so that we can continue to do this work for the long haul is so important. And I feel like there's so few resources out there for thinking about how we can both manage that on an ongoing basis and have a conversation with ourselves and check in, because this is not, unfortunately, but it's life. Like, change is constant. This is not a one and done exercise.
I really appreciate you saying that. I talk about this as being a practice, and it's a practice for me. It's not as if I get this right all the time. And even, from a standpoint of, like, the right ambition side, or the U curve, I should say. I'll just say, even for myself, there are times when I'm kind of like, ooh, I'm a little stagnant. I need to work on that. And there's other times when, ooh, I'm really stretching myself. I need to be thoughtful about this and how I'm managing it. So it is dynamic. We're going to, of course, have these ups and downs. And also, even something as simple as, although it's not necessarily that simple, but having a sustaining plan, it can change, like how I felt I could sustain myself during the pandemic. Of course, that's maybe too big of a change, but like even something like having my meditation practice has kind of fallen off. Like for a time, I was kind of like, I really need that. Or even something like, oh, I used to like this yoga class. Well, now I've gotten bored with it. I don't want to do that anymore. Sometimes you need to replace things just, because they don't work for you anymore. Even something as simple as like, oh, they changed the time for that class. It no longer fits into my schedule. Now I need something different. That can be a reason why. So it is dynamic across many of these dimensions.
Definitely. It makes me think of how many conversations I have with people about like time management as a founder. And honestly, I have to reinvent my schedule and my calendar at least once a quarter. And when I don't, I feel it. Like I'll like kind of have a moment where I'm feeling like, oh, something about my relationship with time is not working. And then sure enough, I'll look at the last time I sat down and rescheduled myself, and it's usually like 3 or 4 months ago.
I can really relate to that for sure.
I am interrupting this episode of the Women Changing the World podcast really quickly to personally invite you to join us inside Girls Club Collective. Our doors only open 4 times a year, and I don't want you to miss your chance. The Girls Club Collective is an intentionally intimate leadership lab for change agents and the personal and professional development community that you've been looking for. Don't just take my word for it, though. When you're submitting your application on our website, girlsclubcollective.co, please be sure to read one of the countless testimonials from our incredible members and alumni. There are so many benefits to being a part of the collective, which is designed around our signature feminine leadership framework. That means you'll have opportunities every month for connection, embodied strategy, visibility, and amplification. You'll also have countless opportunities to connect live and asynchronously with other amazing leaders on topics like reimagining our ambition. Applications are due on September 20th, and our doors won't open again until December. Don't forget to mention our podcast in the Where Did You Hear About the Cohort section on the application. Now, back to the episode. Well, I would love to talk about, you mentioned having a sustaining plan. And I'm curious if you'd be willing to share what some of the key ingredients of a sustaining plan from your perspective might be. I heard a few things in there that like a yoga class or meditation practice. I think there's probably some big like schedule elements to that. But if someone's listening to this and they're like, I want a sustaining plan, what aspects or components of life might they want to consider?
So a couple of things about a sustaining plan that I want to frame up. Parts of this we've already talked about, but a central theme of sustainable ambition that I've been alluding to is that it's personal. And so a sustaining plan, I think what's also really important about this is that it's personal. The other component that we've talked about is this idea of practicing, but where I take that is this idea of also prototyping your sustaining plan so that you see what works best for you. So again, oftentimes we'll use that yoga class as an example. Oftentimes people will say, well, I should be doing a yoga class. I've had a client say this to me and I said, do you like yoga? And she said, no, I hate it. And then I said, so why should you be doing a yoga class? Like that's not going to be what's going to help you, restore yourself. So where I tend to start with a sustaining plan is really kind of having people reflect for themselves on 3 components, like what works best for them to restore their energy, what works for them to protect their energy, and then what works for them to support their energy. And so I have different ways that I kind of prompt around that. It can be anything from, around restore, like what gives you energy, even something, or like how do you get refueled and how do you recover, what works best for you around that. And looking at the kind of different components that are typical around looking at, well-being. You can look at, your physical well-being, your emotional well-being, mental and spiritual energy. So you can look at all these components. Part of why I focus a little bit more on the structure is that there's so much information out there about how one supports one's well-being. So I kind of point people to those core components to look at, but then offer reflections on, okay, well, what works best for me around these components? And then in terms of putting together a sustaining plan, I think what's really helpful is two things. One is to make it real by really thinking about how does this apply to a week? And how does it actually fit into my life? And then the second component that I think is really helpful is to also think about a minimum viable sustaining plan. So it's kind of like, when you have those weeks that are really stretching you and you're feeling like it's quite full, like what's the minimum you need to keep you sustained? So to give you an example of that, like for me, last summer was this for me. And there were a couple strategies that I used. One was, if I was traveling and I could get a workout in, like 15 minutes to me is a sufficient workout. Like, so if I could get myself up early enough to and I have 15-minute workouts that are like videos that I like to do, that was a component of sustaining myself. Sometimes doing a 10-minute meditation is a component of sustaining myself, or just making sure that I'm getting outside for a walk briefly in a day. It could be a part of like those busy times, being really thoughtful about how I'm pacing the work and also about how I'm slotting in times for breaks. So to me, I know it sounds silly and simple. It is, but like, how do you schedule breaks for yourself? And I think that small breaks, there's a lot of research around the power of small breaks, but when are you being thoughtful, especially when you're in a really crunch time of like fitting those things in? So building those components into like a minimum viable sustaining plan. And so already having some ideas of what's important for you around that, so that when you find yourself in those times, you're not just eliminating everything because of the demands, but you're staying true to some of those minimum things that you think are really important for you.
Totally. Oh, I love that framing so much. It makes me think of it. I remember there was a time with a very stressful job in my 20s where at some point I realized I was like, okay, if I can't carve out an hour in the day to like get a workout in, which was like, that was my me time at that stage in my life, then I know something is wrong. And it wasn't like always the workout was not the thing, but it was like, I need to have control over at least the 1 hour that I'm giving myself for something that's for me. And I love like that practice and idea of identifying that for ourselves, because it also recognizes that we live in the real worlds. And every week, as much as we might love every week to be our perfect week, every week's not always going to be our ideal week. But how can we get clear on that baseline minimum of what we need to show up for what we need to show up for, including ourselves?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I love that example of figuring out your hour for yourself. It's great.
Thank you. Yeah, well, and I feel like there's so many things I want to talk to you about. There's so much that we've talked about today that I feel like has touched on so many other fun conversations and themes that we're having on the podcast throughout this season. And really an overarching theme for me right now and in this season, in this moment, is leadership. And I would love to hear. I'm learning so much from the definitions that I'm receiving from our guests. Like, how are you thinking about leadership right now? What does leadership mean to you in this moment?
So I'm going to give you two answers. And one being how I've thought about leadership when I've kind of studied it for myself and was kind of crafting, something that I do with some of the people that I work with around their leadership brand, which is when I looked at the literature and how people talk about leadership, I see it as having two parts. One being this idea of it's really about showing up as your authentic self. A lot of quotes or people that talk about this say like leadership is really stepping into who you really are. And so how do you start to step into that as a leader as you continue to grow? The other is, how do you show up for others? So there's a component of, okay, who am I and how am I being truthful to who I want to be in the world? But then how am I showing up in that way that's contributing to other people and helping them also rise and be the best they can be? And so I see leadership holding those two components. The second piece of it that I guess that I just bringing it to sustainable ambition, or that this kind of concept, is that I guess my hope is that some leaders are thinking about us as humans and are thinking about, helping people achieve more sustainability in their lives with work. If leaders can actually think about this context of us being more holistic human beings and thinking about the sustainability aspect as they lead.
Definitely. It's so called for in this moment, not that it has not been called for in previous moments as well. But I think especially with the shift, for so many people toward remote work and so many of the big existential macro shifts that a lot of us have experienced over the past few years, I do think the human element of work is more important now than ever, especially when we think about the responsibility of leaders. I also wanted to ask you, in the vein of leadership, I know you mentioned earlier, change as a constant, which I think, those of us who are recovering from planning all the things are always learning to appreciate at a new level. Something that you had said when you and I last spoke, Kathy, really stuck with me around, we were talking about the idea of clarity, which for those of us in the coaching world, I think clarity is often used to describe what we help our clients with. And I think you had observed to be something along the lines of well, I'm increasingly thinking that more so than clarity, it's actually being comfortable with not knowing all the answers. That's that self-trust, which has been a huge theme in my work as a person and my work with my clients over the past few years, that's actually perhaps more called for than that clarity of vision and perfect plan. I would love to talk more about that. I guess maybe first to start, what inspired that shift in perspective for you?
It's a great question. And I'm trying to think of the moment it hit me. And I think it's, I've been thinking about this for some time, and I've been thinking about it in the context of, I'll just be transparent and saying framing even a book around how do I help people address what are people who are going through transitions really looking for? And the reality is almost all of my clients come in saying, I want clarity. And I can relate to this. When I'm going through transitions, I want clarity. And I think it was just the reality of maybe just everything that I've been reading, everything that I've been experiencing, of just the reality that we will never have 100% clarity, or it's rare to, or because there's so much change going on. I do think you need some guardrails, and I think around this navigating change, part of my hypothesis is we need some grounding, right? I think that's part of what's really hard about the world right now, is so much is changing around us, but also so much that we feel like we perhaps used to be able to rely on, we don't feel like we can rely on anymore. So it's well, how can we find some grounding? And then, as I said earlier, I still think that vision is important. So it's almost as if it's do I have sufficient clarity such that I can take the next step? And then how do I take that next step and integrate the information I'm learning and adjust as I go forward? I will admit there are times where making choices that are kind of big commitments, I'm going to major in this. I'm going to I'm going to invest in this. And yet, even with those things, I think they're steps on the journey. It's not to say that we can never change, going back to what we talked about earlier. So there's a lot I could say on this in terms of tips or way to think about it. And I will still admit this is something that I'm still digging into and reading more about and doing research on, because it is, per our earlier conversation, it's something that had hit me and was oh, I need to better understand this.
Definitely. Yeah. I so appreciate your willingness to think out loud with me on this topic, because certainly I have found to be true is I'm with you. I think the clarity of the long-term vision is so important. And it's so interesting how when we have and feel self-trust, the need for clarity in the short term, our need can be so much smaller. Like, there's the sense of, I don't know how, I don't know the details, I'm going to figure it out. But I know that you've taken such a research approach to this. I'm curious, has anything jumped out at you as like thoughts, exercises, quotes, advice for building that self-trust muscle?
I'm going to start with something that I just came to an insight around for myself recently because I was exploring this for myself. And I really love polarities. So there's a concept called polarity management. And I've been almost looking at things through this lens all the time now. And it's this concept of really, more often than not, it is not about this or that. It's about this and that. And so in this concept of what we're talking about and this idea of self-trust, I landed on for myself in my own exploration, this idea of like, I can prep and prepare myself for, myself to be able to perform in something. And I can also trust myself in my capabilities to be dynamic and be creative in the moment. And so I think that this, if we just borrow from that concept in terms of what you're asking, this idea of kind of exploring for oneself too, in terms of building even self-trust, this idea that it doesn't have to be either or. You can do things too. You're asking about like, are there certain, like I'm going to take it to concepts and in this example, a couple of things that I think can help us. So Shane Parrish wrote the book Clear Thinking, and he's the founder of Farnham Street. I don't know if people are aware of that, or of his podcast and his work, but he talks about in his book this idea of really positioning yourself. And that is a concept that can support us in terms of like preparation, right? Like, hey, I can position myself well and be ready for change or be ready for those opportunities that can come up. That can also build some degree of self-trust. The other component of it is also, and this gets to that idea of prep versus being prepared for change, which is how can I allow myself to step into experimentation mode and allow myself to kind of say, hey, and I shared this earlier, I'm going to act, I'm going to learn, and how I'm going to like grow from that and step into what's new and integrate things. So I don't know, I might have been a little all over the place with that response, but those are some ideas that I might bring back.
I really appreciate that. And I am such a fan of the idea of like getting in position. It's like, how do we create luck for ourselves, for lack of a better expression? I find it's part magic, part expecting magic and putting yourself in the path of magic. And we only have control over the putting ourselves there, and the expectation. We don't always have control over what comes in or back.
I think that's great to point out too, is acknowledging what you control and what you don't control, for sure.
Timeless theme.
Yes.
Well, I could talk to you for hours. I so appreciate you making time to come on the show. I feel, again, like your work is so needed in this moment, and I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and research that you're bringing to this conversation about something that I know is on the minds and hearts of so many of us right now who care deeply about a better world and a better future. For anyone who's listening who wants to find you, follow you, keep up with you, learn more about your work, because I know we just barely scratched the surface, what are the best places for them to do so?
People can find me on LinkedIn and also at my website, sustainableambition.com. And then they can find the Sustainable Ambition podcast on most podcast players as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'll also put in a plug. I really enjoy your newsletter. So for anyone who, I know there are many newsletter aficionados here, if you're one of them, highly recommend following Kathy's work there. And you alluded to your book.
Yes.
Do we have a publication date or like approximate season that you might be able to share with us? I know it's a work in progress.
Well, right now, I can't believe it, but it's now looking like a year from now, which is so crazy, but that's kind of where my timeline is now landing. So I had hoped for it to come out earlier, but if anybody's written a book before, it is a long process and it's not always a smooth process. So I'm going with the flow and playing the long game with this one.
Oh, I love it. I've heard that from so many people, and 2025 will be here before we know it. So we'll definitely
I know.
keep our eyes out over here and would love to have a book club conversation with you when it comes out. I'm sure it'll be here before we know it.
I'd love that. Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kathy. Really appreciate you making time. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me as well. This is really one of my favorite things to do. So thank you again for having me on.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Women Changing the World podcast. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you're currently listening to it, and don't forget to subscribe for future episodes. You can find me on Instagram at liz.best, that's lis.best, and you can find Girls Club Collective at girls_club_collective. You can also find us on LinkedIn by searching for Liz Best, that's my name, LISBEST, and Girls Club Collective. Join our mail list by visiting the Girls Club Collective homepage and scrolling down to the bottom. You'll be in the loop on upcoming events, retreats, and opportunities to make magic with us, and you'll also receive a monthly love note from my heart to your inbox. I am so excited to keep in touch.